The first time German troops saw dogs running toward their tanks, they didn't even raise their rifles. They laughed. Some thought the animals were lost Soviet mascots, until the explosions started. In a matter of seconds, tanks were on fire, crewmen were screaming, and the battlefield was engulfed in shock. These weren't innocent animals. They were bombs on 4 legs. What the Germans had just witnessed was one of the Red Army's most brutal and controversial tactics: anti-tank dogs, known in Soviet files as Hundminen. Trained, strapped with explosives, and sent charging at enemy armor, these dogs weren't trained to detect bombs, they were trained to become them. The program began during the darkest months of 1941, as Nazi forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory. With tanks rolling fast across the steppes and Soviet defenses collapsing, the Red Army turned to desperation. Dogs once used for communication and logistics were now repurposed as weapons. The logic was simple. A dog could go where a man couldn't, and if it could reach the underside of a tank, it could end a threat the Soviets couldn't otherwise stop. Training these animals was cold, calculated, and cruel. They were kept hungry and taught to associate food with crawling underneath stationary tanks. When the time came, explosives, usually between 10 and 12 kilograms, were mounted on their backs, connected to a pressure trigger that would detonate on contact with the tank's underside. The dogs weren't remote-controlled. They were never coming back. On the battlefield, chaos reigned. When Soviet handlers released the dogs, they sprinted, fast, low, silent. German tank crews had no warning. The dogs would vanish beneath the chassis, and then fire. Steel ripped open, hatches flew off. In some cases, the entire turret was lifted off the hull. The psychological impact was instant and terrifying. Word spread like wildfire. German infantry began opening fire on any dog within sight, regardless of behavior. Tank commanders closed their hatches even in friendly zones, fearing that a blur of fur could mean death. In some divisions, soldiers reported freezing at the sight of a lone stray, not from kindness, but pure fear. The dogs had become ghosts with fangs. But the tactic wasn't perfect. Many dogs panicked amid gunfire and explosions, running in the wrong direction, or worse, back towards Soviet lines. There were confirmed incidents of Soviet tanks being destroyed by their own anti-tank dogs. The Red Army suppressed these reports, but on the ground, Soviet handlers watched in horror as their own weapons turned against them. Despite the risks, the program continued. Soviet propaganda painted the dogs as heroes. Posters showed loyal companions bravely racing into battle, but in reality, they were disposable tools in a war of survival. The handlers knew the truth. So did the Germans. The dogs were not seen as soldiers. They were seen as weapons. And they worked. One of the most shocking aspects of the anti-tank dog tactic was its simplicity. No advanced optics, no mechanical targeting systems, no wires or signals. Just training, instinct, and sacrifice. And yet this crude method held up entire German advances. Tanks rerouted, convoys stalled, infantry refused to move without armored cover. By 1943, the program had largely faded, replaced by more conventional anti-tank methods, but its legacy endured. German soldiers never forgot the fear. The Soviets never admitted the scale. And history still debates its morality. But one thing remains certain: the battlefield had never seen anything like it before or since. The psychological warfare created by the anti-tank dog program was unmatched. German tank crews, once confident in their armor, began showing signs of breakdown. Reports from the Eastern Front documented cases of tank operators refusing to advance through open terrain unless infantry first cleared the path of any movement, animal or otherwise. The battlefield was no longer just steel against steel. It was steel versus silence. Some German officers had attempted to fight fear with cold logic. They ordered their men to shoot all dogs on sight, regardless of appearance or location. In rare cases, German units even employed their own trained dogs to sniff out Soviet explosives or chase away potential threats. But nothing fully erased the terror of seeing a dog emerge from the smoke and charge forward with deadly intent. The Soviets, meanwhile, pushed propaganda hard. Newsreels inside the USSR showed heroic footage of sacrifice dogs running beneath fake tanks while upbeat music played. Soldiers were told these animals were willing martyrs for the motherland. But behind the scenes, many handlers broke down. Some refused to continue releasing dogs, especially after seeing them run back toward their own lines, tails wagging, unaware of the bomb on their back. In the field, German troops began using dogs themselves, but not as weapons. Units kept strays as mascots, partially out of superstition, partially for morale. They would feed and care for them, and in some cases, these mascots would sleep beside tanks, as if to ward off the nightmare of a Soviet attack. It was a strange contradiction. One dog meant hope, another meant death. Perhaps the most shocking part of the entire tactic was its unpredictability. Some dogs succeeded, some failed, some simply vanished. But every time the Soviets released them into battle, they introduced chaos, uncalculated, untimed, and uncontrollable. That chaos made commanders hesitate, made convoys slow down, made every shadow suspicious. Tactically, the Red Army never saw the dog units as permanent solutions. They were placeholders, emergency answers during a time when the Soviet Union was bleeding equipment and men. The idea was never about elegance, it was about survival. And it worked long enough to give engineers time to develop better mines, portable rocket systems, and shaped charges. By 1943, new anti-tank tools had begun to replace the dogs. Still, the memory lingered. In memoirs of panzer commanders, the word dog often appeared not with laughter, but with dread. No matter how strong your armor, it meant nothing if the enemy could send death beneath your treads without warning. Interestingly, the German military archives from late 1942 include training material on canine-based threats. Officers were instructed on how to identify movement patterns of anti-tank dogs and how to distinguish between random strays and Soviet handlers. The mere existence of such documents shows how deeply the threat had penetrated the German psyche. After the war, Allied intelligence reviewed captured Soviet files on the dog program. The numbers were never fully confirmed. Hundreds were trained, many deployed, some successful, many not. But the lesson was clear. In a war defined by tanks, planes, and rockets, it was the smallest, simplest creature that had left one of the deepest scars on the battlefield. The tactic worked far beyond the battlefield. Anti-tank dogs didn't just stop tanks, they froze entire operations. German columns halted for hours, unsure if a single dog ahead meant danger or not. When reconnaissance units failed to confirm the path was clear, commanders delayed movement, sometimes until nightfall. A $300 million armored spearhead could be stalled by a starving animal wearing explosives. Reports from Army Group Center in 1942 show how fear of canine mines caused miscommunication between divisions. Panzer officers refused to advance without infantry screening. Infantry demanded armor support before moving through open terrain. The result? Paralysis, not from firepower, but from uncertainty. And in war, hesitation kills. The Soviets understood this psychological value. Even in operations where the dogs weren't used, rumors were deliberately spread that they had been deployed. Sometimes fake dog tracks were created near enemy lines. German radio intercepts even recorded panicked calls reporting dozens of explosive dogs in Sector 14B when none were there. The Soviets had turned fear into a weapon more effective than the dogs themselves. German war photographers were instructed not to document incidents involving anti-tank dogs. The High Command feared that images of elite Panzer units being destroyed by animals would demoralize troops and embolden the enemy. But soldiers wrote about them anyway. Letters home, field diaries, whispered stories in foxholes. The myth grew larger than the tactic itself. In occupied villages, locals were caught in the middle. Some tried to hide stray dogs from advancing Soviet lines, fearing they'd be taken and turned into weapons. Others fed them in secret, seeing them as innocent victims. In the chaos of retreat and advance, more than one peasant child was killed trying to stop a dog from being taken by Soviet troops. The brutality of the tactic extended far beyond soldiers. Western allies, especially the British, were appalled when they learned about the Soviet program through intelligence leaks in 1943. MI6 described it as barbaric but effective. A joint British-American report even debated whether a similar tactic could be adapted for the Pacific Theater, but the idea was rejected. No Western military dared cross that line. The Soviets, for their part, remained quiet after the war. State archives were sealed. The official narrative praised the loyalty and bravery of wartime animals, but made no mention of the dogs used as bombs. Veterans who had served as handlers were told to stay silent. Some did. Others never recovered from what they'd done. A Soviet lieutenant later interviewed in the 1970s described it plainly. We trained them to find food under tanks. They trusted us. Then we strapped bombs to them. I still see their eyes when I sleep. For him, the enemy wasn't the German tank. It was the order he obeyed. His words never made it to the history books, but they echo louder than gunfire. Today, few monuments mention the anti-tank dogs. In Moscow, a statue honors wartime service animals, but the plaque omits the darker chapters. No one wants to remember the dogs who didn't return, or those who did and were shot before reaching shelter. Their sacrifice was unchosen, their legacy unclaimed. But in the minds of those who fought, the memory never left. In the cold mud of the Eastern Front, among twisted steel and scorched earth, even the most hardened Panzer commander would flinch at the sight of four legs moving through the fog. Because sometimes the deadliest weapon in the war didn't walk on 2 feet. By 1942, the German military began developing countermeasures against the Soviet dog mines. It wasn't enough to shoot them on sight. Commanders started issuing formal orders outlining what to do when a dog was spotted near armor. These included flare alerts, preemptive MG bursts into open terrain, and even the use of flamethrowers to deter approach. The dogs had become such a threat that entire protocols were rewritten. In some units, tank commanders assigned designated dog watchers, infantrymen whose sole duty was to observe for canine movement during advances. These soldiers were trained to shoot low and fast. But even with these precautions, nothing guaranteed safety. One misstep, one dog the watcher didn't see in time, and a Panzer would be ripped apart in seconds.
Some German units even attempted to use flak-Vierling anti-aircraft cannons, turned downward at low angles to clear fields ahead of tank columns. It was overkill, but effective. Whole rows of hedges and brush were shredded to eliminate potential hiding spots. The battlefield was no longer just contested territory, it was sterilized of life. But the overreaction had consequences. Using anti-aircraft cannons, flamethrowers, and constant gunfire against every shadow drained resources and fatigued men. Soldiers grew paranoid, twitching at the slightest movement. In letters intercepted by Allied intelligence, German infantrymen described dreams of dogs with no eyes, or machines that barked before exploding. The enemy had turned fear into a sustainable weapon. The Soviets watched closely. When they noticed how much chaos the dogs had caused, they leaned further into psychological manipulation. Radio broadcasts inserted barking sounds behind enemy lines at night. In winter, they left paw prints in fresh snow leading toward German camps. One Soviet officer joked in a post-war account, "Sometimes the fear of the dog did more damage than the dog itself." This paranoia disrupted the German command chain. Field reports from Army Group North show commanders disobeying orders to advance after receiving unconfirmed dog sightings. Recon was halted. Minesweeper teams refused to proceed. Combat engineers delayed bridge construction over rumors of trained dogs in the water. Morale collapsed in silence. Back in the USSR, a new wave of handlers were recruited, many fresh from school, told they were training service animals for defense. They were never told what the dogs would be used for until deployment. Some handlers defected or deserted once they realized the truth. Others stayed, silently obeying, unable to stop what had already begun. Tragically, many dogs weren't killed by the enemy. They were killed by their own side. Soviet soldiers were instructed to shoot returning dogs on sight to prevent accidental explosions. The line between enemy and ally blurred. The battlefield had no mercy for mistakes, even the four-legged kind. In a chilling 1944 incident, a wounded Soviet dog crawled back to its handler, wagging its tail, the bomb on its back still intact. The handler, young, just 18, couldn't do it. He froze. Another soldier took the shot. The explosion killed them both. That event was never recorded officially, but other soldiers wrote it down, swearing never to forget it. By the war's end, few Soviet handlers spoke of what they had done. The medals awarded meant little. Their silence wasn't patriotic, it was protective. Because they hadn't just trained animals to die, they had trained trust itself to betray. By 1944, the Soviet anti-tank dog program was nearing its end, not because it had failed, but because it had already done enough. More effective portable weapons like the RPG-43 and PTRS-41 were becoming standard, and handlers could barely keep up with dog training amid the chaos of the Eastern Front. Yet, in the background, a few units still held on to their last trained dogs, unsure if they'd ever use them again. One such case was recorded outside the Polish town of Siedlce, where a Soviet unit, low on ammunition and cut off from armor support, released a single dog into a German column. It detonated beneath a Panzer IV, blowing the tank apart and triggering a retreat. It was one of the final known successes of the tactic, and one of the last times it was officially used. But even as the tactic was dying, the controversy was growing. Soviet officers in the field had begun questioning the ethics of using dogs as suicide weapons. Some feared retaliation from the international community. Others simply couldn't stomach the emotional cost. "We didn't just send dogs to die," one officer later wrote. "We made them trust us first." Behind the front lines, the propaganda machine continued without pause. Soviet newspapers printed heroic tales of canine warriors, carefully avoiding details of how they died. Illustrations showed dogs leaping through fire and returning to their handlers victorious. The public never saw the reality: bloody fields, torn leashes, and broken bodies buried in silence. In German territory, captured Soviet handlers were interrogated by the SS and Wehrmacht officers. Some were beaten, some were executed, not for what they had done, but because they had done it with dogs. The idea enraged the Germans on a personal level. It was seen not just as a weapon, but as a betrayal of nature itself. Among Soviet veterans, the anti-tank dog program became taboo. Even those who hadn't participated refused to speak of it. Some believed it was buried to preserve the legacy of wartime unity. Others believed it was simply shameful. In reunions and memoirs, one thing was clear: the dogs were gone, but their ghosts remained. Historians, too, remain divided. Some consider the tactic a logical, if cruel, solution in a total war. Others call it a war crime in disguise. The Geneva Convention of 1949 would later prohibit the use of animals as live munitions, but during World War II, there were no such limits. Everything was fair, everything was necessary. That's what made it so terrifying. In Soviet archives, most records of the dog units were destroyed or sealed. Entire training bases vanished from official maps. Even today, the exact number of dogs trained and deployed remains unknown. Some historians estimate several hundred. Others claim it was over 1,000. But what matters isn't the number. It's the silence that followed. In post-war literature, the anti-tank dogs rarely appear. Soviet history books omit them entirely. Western books mention them as footnotes, curiosities from a brutal front. Only in the testimonies of a few broken handlers and a handful of letters do they survive. Faint echoes of a tactic no one wants to remember, but no one can truly forget. And so the story of the anti-tank dog fades, not because it lacks impact, but because it cuts too deep. It reminds the world that in a war where tanks, planes, and rockets ruled, sometimes the most haunting weapon came on 4 legs: trusting, loyal, and doomed. Long after the last battle was fought, the legend of the anti-tank dogs refused to die. In military academies, instructors spoke of them only in whispers, as a footnote in Eastern Front case studies. But among frontline veterans, especially those who served in armor divisions, the memory of those dogs was as vivid as any air raid or artillery strike. They didn't talk about it in public. They remembered it in their nightmares. Post-war psychological evaluations conducted on German and Soviet veterans revealed recurring trauma linked to the use of animals in warfare. Some tank crewmen reported anxiety at the sound of barking for decades after the war. Soviet handlers who survived often showed signs of guilt-driven depression. One Red Army medic described a soldier who refused to speak for weeks after killing a dog that returned to him wagging its tail. In 1957, a Soviet general anonymously submitted a report to the Ministry of Defense titled "On the Ethical Risk of Uncontrolled Weapons." While never published, it included a section titled on the deployment of canine-carried charges, urging the government to never revive the tactic. His plea was simple: "We trained loyalty to die. It should never be done again." But despite silence from official records, war fiction across Europe kept the legend alive. In Cold War-era pulp novels and comics, anti-tank dogs became ghostly symbols of Soviet brutality. Western propaganda leaned into the shock factor, portraying the USSR not just as ideological enemies, but as violators of nature itself. The tactic wasn't just disturbing, it was dehumanizing. In East Germany, however, the tactic was turned into a twisted form of pride. A 1962 military parade in Dresden featured a symbolic war dog unit tribute. Not real dogs, but mannequins strapped with mock explosives. The display was quickly removed after Western media called it a celebration of cruelty. But by then the point had already been made. War forgets nothing and forgives less. Across the Soviet countryside, countless mass graves of animals remained unmarked. Handlers who survived were rarely recognized. Some received quiet medals, others were dismissed entirely. The program had been useful, but it was also an embarrassment. There were no statues for the dogs, only silence. In the decades following the war, animal rights activists began petitioning for memorials to honor the forgotten four-legged soldiers. But the moment the phrase anti-tank was mentioned, governments withdrew support. No one wanted to deal with the ethics. No one wanted to explain how dogs were taught to die, and no one wanted to admit how effective they really were. One retired Soviet general, interviewed in 1988, broke ranks and told a military journal, "The dogs held back tanks. They stalled the war machine. I respected them more than some of the men I served with." He was ridiculed for the statement, but never retracted it. He called them soldiers. No one else did. To this day, no single military museum features a complete, honest exhibit about the Soviet anti-tank dog program. At best, they appear in a footnote, an obscure caption, or a side panel, always neutral, always clinical. But veterans don't speak in captions. They speak with shaking hands, glassy eyes, and memories they can't burn away. Because in a war where men built machines to kill each other, the deadliest weapon, for a time, was a creature bred for trust, loyalty, and companionship. That betrayal echoes louder than any bomb.
The war ended. Borders shifted, flags changed, but no one ever came back for the dogs. There were no repatriation efforts, no military recovery missions. Most of them were simply left behind, confused, waiting, loyal to the end. They had done what they were trained to do, and they had been abandoned. In a 1994 interview, former Soviet engineer Ivan Pavluchenko shared a detail rarely recorded. One dog returned after the explosion. Half of its body was gone, but it crawled back to its handler. That man never spoke again. This story circulated quietly in military hospitals, shared in low voices. It became legend, not because it was rare, but because it was common. Even decades later, Soviet war veterans avoided questions about the dog units. Some broke into tears. Others simply stood up and left the room. The topic didn't evoke pride. It evoked ghosts. It was the price they paid for survival. One whispered, "We sent loyalty to die," and it did.
Western analysts who reviewed the Soviet military archives in the 1990s were stunned by the scale. Over 40,000 dogs were trained for wartime service. Of these, an estimated 15,000 were specifically conditioned for explosive missions. The survival rate was near zero. They weren't expected to survive. That was the point. In one heartbreaking photograph buried deep in Russian archives, a young boy is seen hugging a German shepherd wearing a faded Soviet patch. The dog's eyes are tired. The boy is smiling. The caption reads, "Final training, deployment in 2 days." That single image encapsulated everything: innocence, obedience, and betrayal. By the 2000s, younger generations of Russians began learning about the anti-tank dogs not from textbooks, but from foreign documentaries. The state remained silent. School curriculum skipped the topic. It wasn't just a forgotten tactic, it was an erased one. But erasure is never complete. In 2012, a Ukrainian artist unveiled a sculpture titled "The Silent Soldier." It depicted a sitting dog with a metal vest, staring into the distance. The plaque read, "They followed orders." The piece was vandalized within a week, twice. Some called it disrespectful. Others said it was too honest. And yet, small communities of historians, animal rights advocates, and war descendants began keeping the memory alive. Blogs, museum petitions, and first-person accounts started surfacing online. For many, it wasn't about glorifying the tactic. It was about acknowledging the ones who had no choice. Because in every war, there are soldiers whose names never get engraved in marble. There are sacrifices so uncomfortable that history tries to forget them. But truth, no matter how buried, eventually finds a way to bark from beneath the rubble. And sometimes, the loudest sound in war is the silence left behind by those who never returned.